Buenas tardes a todos y bienvenidos a este cafecito con Centro Summer Fellows. Welcome, everybody. I'm Cristel Jusino Diaz, Centro's Director of Research Programs, and I am so excited to be here this evening with our three fantastic summer research fellows. So this summer fellowship was part of the Rooted and Relational Year 1 initiative. The theme of year 1 was archives, memory, and the present past of Puerto Rico. And to close out that really wonderful and nourishing year of research and conversations, we invited 2 researchers and 1 artist in residence to spend the summer working on projects related to this theme in our archive. So tonight we'll have the opportunity to hear from all 3 of our fellows, to see what they were up to this summer, right? And I think this has been a really lovely experience. It's always great to work with our researchers, right? But to see how they work together and how their work connects has been really exciting for me, and I hope that everybody else will be able to appreciate that as well. So that we can get started, I'm going to read our fellows' bios, and then we can get started with the presentation. So Alexandria Ramos studies early 20th century Latinx literature and loves working with archival texts. She is developing a book manuscript tentatively titled Pedagogies of Struggle, The Print Politics of Latinx and Asian American Writer Activist, 1898 to 1968. This project explores the archives of anti-racist, feminist, and anti-colonial writer-activists in pre-civil rights era and considers the relationship between literature, learning, and social justice. Her research on activist pedagogies has been supported by the American Association of University Women and the Asian Pacific American Institute at NYU. Her other research and teaching interests include women of color feminisms, borders and diasporas, and decolonial thought. Conor Coco Tomas Reed is a Puerto Rican Irish, gender fluid street scholar of social movements in the Americas and the Caribbean, and the author of New York Liberation School. They are developing a new book project, Hemisphere in Bloom, as well as the co-edited multilingual anthology, Black Feminist Studies in the Americas and the Caribbean. Coco is a contributing editor with Lapis Journal and Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative, and serves on the board of directors for CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies at CUNY. They have been immersed in 2 decades of struggles at the City University of New York and in New York City around transforming education and public space, anti-imperialism, police and prison abolition, solidarity with Palestine and Puerto Rico, reproductive rights, housing justice, and beyond. And finally, Estelle Maisonett is an interdisciplinary artist, educator, and arts advocate whose work spans photography, printmaking, sculpture, painting, and video. Born in the Bronx with Puerto Rican and Mexican heritage, her practice investigates how personal and cultural relationships to materials shape notions of identity, memory, and history. Maisonett's large-scale collages and sculptural installations often incorporate found objects, such as discarded garments and urban detritus, which she recontextualizes to challenge dominant narratives and explore the intersections of Latinx identity. Her work functions as a form of cultural archaeology, merging autobiographical and ethnographic archives to examine how colonized and fragmented histories are formed and preserved through material culture. Through her process of scaffolding, stacking, and gluing, Maisonett creates layered composite spaces that invite dialogue on the politics of identity, cultural fragmentation, and how materials both preserve and distort our understanding of the past. So with that, I am going to, let me pull up the presentation, and Alexandria can get us started. 1 second. Sorry. Multiple. Let's see. Here we go. Alexandria, it's all yours.
Thank you, Cristel. Can you pass it to the next couple of slides? One more. Okay, so thank you so much. Jesus Colon was a diasporic Afro-Puerto Rican writer, communist, and community organizer who lived in New York City during the early mid-20th century. And I did research in his personal papers, which were donated to Centro after his death. And his papers were a founding collection for the Centro archives. I focused on materials that document Colon's work as a community organizer. He was an organizer with the International Workers Order and many other Latino social clubs and political organizations in New York City. The through line that I find across Colon's archive is that he was deeply invested in the political education of his community. My research focuses on his work as an educator. He did formally teach at the communist-run Jefferson School of Social Science. This used to be near Union Square. But in general, when I think about education, I think about the way that he seeks to teach people through literature. He writes about the history and political struggles of Puerto Ricans, both on the island and in the diaspora. His writings educate readers about racism, colonialism, capitalism, and they also elicit a sense of solidarity from among workers from all walks of life. Colon's writings offer theories about how people learn and become politicized and how to win people over to the left. He's thought a lot about the role that literature plays in political education, and he was really invested in the practice of reading literature aloud. Can you pass the slide, please? So he has several writings about the lector, who's the cigar factory reader. The reading in cigar factories was a practice that started in Cuba in the 1800s, and then it spread to Puerto Rico as well as cigar factories in Florida and New York City in the US. And while workers hand-rolled cigars, the lector would read aloud to them. And Colon says that he read things, the reader, the lector read things like socialist newspapers, but also literary classics like Les Miserables. And I just put a picture on the left. This is not from the Centro Archives. This is from Araceli Tinajero's book on the cigar factory reader, but you can see like the people are sitting at their workstations rolling cigars, and the lector is kind of on a platform above them with a newspaper. And Colon, so in this way, as the lector was reading aloud to them as they worked, workers who couldn't read and write were able to gain access to literary classics and international current events. And Colon says that cigar workers had extremely high levels of quote unquote cultural and political development. He writes about the lector in his book, A Puerto Rican in New York. But in his papers, there are several drafts of another essay manuscript that is called Reading Aloud in Key West. So I just put that there's an image of that on the bottom. There's notes and a partial manuscript for this essay about reading aloud in the lector and cigar factories in Florida. And then there was an article that was published posthumously in 1977 that I think was from the draft of this manuscript, published in World Magazine. So I think that Colon must have been really inspired by the cigar workers' practice and the idea of the lector, because the idea of reading aloud as a political education comes up elsewhere in his papers. Crystal, could you pass the slide, please? Thank you. So there are a lot of materials throughout his papers that have to do with poetry readings, and like over the years. And this one that's on the screen, I don't expect you to read everything that's in the entire photo, but this is an example. This is from 1966. It's a report from a club that he was involved in. And I just picked an excerpt that says, "We organized the lovers of poetry, amantes de la poesía, and rented a community center in one of the big projects. One of the best known Puerto Rican poetry declaimers was invited to recite. Around 50 people came. Several mistakes were made. First of all, the poetry selected was left poetry, and the mass of Puerto Ricans still not as politically developed." There's typos in the original. "Still not as politically developed to like the latest poetry of Guillen, and Neruda prefers poetry of love and passion. none of these kind was offered to them. We think that nevertheless, that a start was made, and using the medium of poetry, we could build an organization of a few hundred members that will not only come to like the poetry of Guillen and Neruda, but also the Spanish translation, the poetry of Mayakovsky and Yetusenko and everything that goes with it. End quote. So they organized this poetry reading in a housing project, and the event featured poetry by Nicolas Guillen and Pablo Neruda, who are two Latin American communist poets, and the other poets that are mentioned were Soviet poets. Essentially, Colon is saying that they chose poetry that was too political, and that the people at the event weren't ready to hear those political messages. And he's saying that to politically educate people, you have to meet them where they're at. If you get people to enjoy love poems, they'll develop a taste for poetry, and then they'll be more open to hearing the messages that are in more political poems. So this memo, it contains a teaching philosophy that's about the specifics of how to use poetry to politicize people. So I just have one more slide. This is, I found, like I said, a lot of flyers for events over the years that included poetry readings, and this one was my favorite one that I found. It's from, I'm guessing, the late 1940s or maybe early 1950s, and the event is from a forum about the issue of Puerto Rican independence. Colon gave a speech, as did Reverend Guillermo Cato Thorner, who wrote the novel Tropico in Manhattan. The famous poet Julia de Burgos gave a reading, and there was also a musical performance. So this is just one example. There were a lot of other flyers for various events that included poetry readings, like there were Mother's Day celebrations that included poetry readings, social dances, and things like that. So I suspect that at the other events, the poetry readings could have been a way to kind of sneak in something political at an event that was supposed to be just social and not political necessarily. But I'm going to stop here and hand it over to the next person. So thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, Alex. And I want to share immense gratitude to Cristel, Camacho, Cristobal, and to the Centro crew for your support and community during this residency, to Alex and Estelle for sharing across our respective work, and to the attendees for coming through tonight. So it's really good to see you all. So to conduct research for a new book project called Hemisphere in Bloom on social movements in the Americas and the Caribbean, I dove into several collections at Centro that I'd like to share. And next slide, please. So for one chapter's focus on reproductive justice strategies in the Americas and the Caribbean, I looked at Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias and Lourdes Torres's papers on how 1970s and 80s communities opposed forced sterilization while demanding free, safe, and legal abortion access. Now, folks who are tuning in may have heard about the 1970 Young Lords takeover of Lincoln Hospital. And if you haven't seen it yet, I encourage y'all to check out Emma Frances Snyder's film Takeover about this time period. And Dr. Rodriguez Trias was at this time brought from Puerto Rico to head up Lincoln Hospital's pediatrics ward. She co-created the Committee to End Sterilization Abuse in 1970 of that year, and then the Coalition for Abortion Rights and Against Sterilization Abuse in 1979. She was then central to an early 1980s fight to overturn the appointment to Lincoln Hospital of someone named Dr. Antonio Silva, who had previously headed in Puerto Rico a family planning agency that was responsible for sterilizing 35% of women in Puerto Rico. And so you heard that right. Silva was then being brought to the Bronx to then head up the hospital's gynecology and obstetrics ward. So uh, Rodriguez Trias and many others were participating in a kind of movement that ultimately reversed Silva from being able to head up that division. And her papers, the papers of Lourdes Torres and others at Centro, documented how mass sterilization was an explicit form of population control of Black, Puerto Rican, Chicana, Asian American communities, and that therefore these were the very coalitions that came together to defend each other's lives. Next slide, please. For another chapter's focus on how Puerto Rican cultural workers and organizers were inspired by and mobilized the South African anti-apartheid struggle in a kind of deep complicity, a kind of prismatic complicity with Palestine, Puerto Rico decolonization, anti-policing campaigns, and beyond, I read through Richie Perez and Rafael Anglada Lopez's materials. In the late 1980s, when Israeli military aid for South African apartheid was being hamstrung by the Palestinians' first intifada, Richie Perez's materials included these events for South Africa, for Palestine, for Puerto Rico, all in solidarity with each other, as well as many flyers that were condemning the rampant police murders of Black, Puerto Rican, and Dominican peoples in New York City. Next slide, please. For Anglada Lopez, his papers also documented a critical Caribbean conference that was in solidarity with the people of South Africa and Namibia, held in Puerto Rico in 1987. And I show a couple of quotations from this conference, basically defending the quote, inalienable right of the people of South Africa to armed struggle under these conditions, denouncing, quote, the United States government's obstruction of an international strategy against apartheid, and condemning, quote, several Latin American countries that continue to buy weapons from South Africa, for which Israel serves as the main intermediary. So let me know if any of this sounds familiar. Um, Next slide, please. So in taking a look at these materials and then kind of zooming out across other archives at Centro, I looked at how Israel's propaganda efforts to justify its occupation of Palestine sought to influence Puerto Rican politicians and organizations with free trips to Israel in the early 1970s after the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, through the early 1980s after the Israel-backed Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon, and onwards. One person whose work is at Centro, Kathy Andrade, a photographer, documented a 1971 trip to Israel with the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, their meetings with the Histadrut, which is Israel's national organization of trade unions that operates apartheid labor conditions. And Andrade also documented Israel's involvement in the Puerto Rican Day parades of years before. Manuel Manny Diaz's 1984 trip to Israel with the Black and Puerto Rican Caucus, the National Puerto Rican Coalition, the Chancellor of New York City Public Schools at the time, and others shows a color trifold pamphlet called The Kibbutz in Israel and a quote unquote Our Encounter publication in Spanish by the now scorned Anti-Defamation League. Another person, a U.S. congressman from the Bronx, Roberto Garcia, his 1985 trip to Israel and Spain was part of a successful initiative to develop diplomatic relations between the two countries. And in taking a look at these materials, these were really significant contradictions of people from Puerto Rico opposing South African apartheid and defending Puerto Rican sovereignty, while also either directly justifying or their actions in the service of Israel justifying its settler colonization of Palestine. And it was very fruitful to uncover and reflect upon. We'll share more when we talk about how this relates to our present moment, but feeling gratitude for this, and we'll now kick it to Estelle.
Thank you both. Let me just share my screen. One moment. Okay. All right. Sorry. There you go. Okay, so my project was called Archiving New York Identity, a Living Visual Record. And to the left, I have one of my assemblages. I wanted to, why can't I go to the next slide? There you go. I wanted to start with Histories We Carry, which was a solo exhibition I did last year at the Latinx Project at NYU. It was curated by Joanna Fernandez, and I wanted to start with this exhibition because I wanted to highlight this word carry and thinking about histories that are embedded in objects and embedded in walls and embedded in sort of the materiality of everyday culture. When we think about New Yorican identity, specifically as a Puerto Rican from the Bronx. And this is this is sort of how I collect the objects that I use in my assemblages. I think about them as artifacts, things that people leave behind, things that sort of carry the story of how they got there and the communities they were left in. This work, Historical Abyss, is a work I made in 2022 after visiting Puerto Rico and while working at in grad school. And so I was working with some of the digital archives there at Yale where they had access to the New York Times. And so in this work, 48 transfers of articles from the New York Times are transferred onto this panel where viewers have to shift their body from left to right in order to be able to read the articles. And part of this effort was to talk about sort of access to history and how challenging it is, but how embedded it is in our everyday landscape. And so thinking about ways to force viewers to do the work of learning. Um, and that's sort of the technique that I'm employing while working at Centro and working with the archives and developing an artist book. This is another work, Tracing Roots. And so again, like thinking about objects in the home and how they're carried through past and present, we can sort of see some of those cultural influxes. So on the left is a piece called Tracing Roots. It's a portrait of my parents. And on the right is actually an installation of a casita at a museum in Puerto Rico that I saw after making this work. And so thinking about sort of the way altars are built or the things that are hung up on the wall, the things we keep with us. Yeah. Similarly, sharing some works that document neighborhoods. So this is SOS the Bronx, New York. It's printed from photographs I've taken of neighborhoods in the Bronx that no longer exist on steel air ducts that were collected from buildings that were torn down. This is a Queen and Queens. This is my current neighborhood. And this one's called Just Like Grandma Used to Make Them. So using resin, sort of this material that's often used in museums to think about how we preserve, how we want to hold on to, but objects that sort of can't be held on to. So this idea of the pastele, which traditionally represents sort of the racial history of Puerto Rico, right? We have like the African origins, Taino origins, and the Spanish origins all wrapped up in this dish. That's constantly sort of shifting. And so putting it in resin is an attempt to hold on to it, knowing that it'll probably melt over time and it'll just be liquid in a hole of where the pastele once was. And I'm gonna move forward a little bit, but again, thinking about how these objects show up in my practice. This work is called Cariño. It's of my nephew and I. And here's a newspaper that I found talking about sort of the challenge in educating bilingual students right now in the US. Well, in 2021. So I want to jump now to the archives and how I've been thinking about them. I've been asking these questions about what's collected in archives and how, and what sort of objects do we find there? What like deems an object archival? And some of the things that I found, which will show up in books and some of my assemblages, are these holiday cards, which I love from Jesus Colon. And they're personally made, they're silk screens. I love how they like show an image of diversity um, and that they were kept. It's something that I think I do as well, where I keep a bunch of holiday cards. And so thinking about ways that this can show up in the book, these sort of intimate moments and messages to one another. Um, this is like an image of Miles Davis in the Eduardo Vega Yunque papers. He was a novelist. Many things that were interesting in this box, including these stickers, bumper stickers to be specific, a lotto ticket. So really thinking what Puerto Rican identity sort of looks like as it sits in the archive in terms of materiality, but also in terms of my own practice. Here's some clothing that I found from Gilberto Garena Valentin papers. So these are all of his clothes, hat, and glasses. And as I'm going along, I'm looking into these objects and thinking about the stories behind them, the lives they lived, the protests they were a part of, the bodies they were on, the sort of physical weight, of an object, but also the emotional weight as well. And that collapsing of time that sort of happens. This is a magnet, a refrigerator magnet from Jesus Colon. Hair from Frank Torres, a journalist, when he was 2 years old. He documented the Young Lords Breakfast Club. A beautiful hand-carved saint from Ponce. And periodicals And so using all of these sort of images and objects and documents, not only am I creating an artist book, but I'm working with Centro to create a digital platform where the community can upload images of objects in their home, but of also photographs and documents to sort of fill these institutional gaps in the archive, and thinking of ways in which digital archives can exist on platforms that are part of institutions that extend the archive as well. Yeah, it's a little bit about my project. Wow, it's good on time.
Thank you so much. This is all just I'm so excited by your work, and I really can't wait to see where these projects go. I have a question for all of you. And while our panelists answer this question, I want to encourage everybody in the audience to please submit questions in the Q&A box that we can get to right after this question that I will ask our panelists, which is, in looking at our community histories, social movements, and personal keepsakes, what lessons do they offer for contemporary movements? Who would like to go first?
I can get us started and had a couple of images to share too, Cristel. Thank you for that
I
question.
can, would you like me to share screen it again?
Yeah, that
Or
would be great.
Great, 1 second.
Yeah, this is now on slide 14. So thinking in brief, the Centro papers, for those of you who haven't gotten to visit them, absolutely crucial to come visit, spend time there, work with the people who were there. They contain all of these incredible lessons and artifacts of earlier struggles that can inform what we're doing. And it was amazing to see all of these multiple movements that were nestled together, remixing strategies with each other, and seeing a lot of movement folk, radical scholars, artists who were also coming to Centro, so to be able to pay attention to it being this important convergence space. And I saw that a lot of the political work of Puerto Ricans, Palestinians, South Africans were being entwined, such that other related movements were really buoyed by these steady heartbeats of liberation. And thinking about in this present moment, some of the most visionary actions against the ruling fascistic order that we're all trying to survive and counteract are being catalyzed by many of our comrades to the south of us. So thinking about glitter bomb direct actions against Mexican police precincts, crowd performance art in Chile that challenges the rapist in your path, community takeovers of Puerto Rican schools shuttered by neocolonial debt. And to share a little bit more about the relationship between Palestine and Puerto Rico, next slide, please. So many of you all know that after in 2024, there was a wave of Gaza solidarity encampments across the United States, including in CUNY at City College. They were brutally shut down, but then a proliferation of encampments emerged across Latin America and the Caribbean, including at the University of Puerto Rico. And thinking about ways that people in UPR were highlighting how the displacement and gentrification of some Puerto Rican communities were being perpetuated by Zionist settlers, the campus's relationship with arms manufacturing companies. And a friend of mine, Natalia Ibrahim Abu Farah Davila, put it this way. She said, as long as Puerto Rico is a colony, Zionism will be present on Puerto Rican soil. And so, in the spirit of this comrade's words, I'm hoping that we can try to think about clearly stating how imperialism and colonization are forms of political violence that are deeply embedded in this country, not an anomaly. And I welcome everyone here and those who you know to see the Center for Puerto Rican Studies as a kind of convergent space for real visionary radical thinking and praxis in this moment. And to think about archival work being deeply material, but also necessarily imaginative, so that we can think about how to wield these records in the movements that we're involved in the present. So with that, I'll kick it onwards to Alex or Estelle. Curious to hear from you.
Estelle. No, me?
No, I can go. I'm just kidding. Hard to follow that, Coco. Um,
Oh, hush. No, I'm curious.
Look what he said. No, I'm kidding. Um, one of the lessons, and I think, it's been an incredibly difficult time. It's been difficult to make work. It's been difficult to be out, to be part of a lot of the systems that I've found like refuge in the past, the education system being one of them. One of the lessons, and I had to write it down, I hold close to me is that movements are built not only on public action, but on intimate everyday practices of care. We always say it, but we don't always do it. The archive makes visible how political work has always been tethered to cultural work and personal life. In the Petra Allende papers, for example, a protest flyer might sit alongside a family photograph or a bingo card. That juxtaposition reminds us that resistance is not separate from joy, from gathering, or from making a home. Contemporary movements often focus, as we should, on urgency and visibility, but the archive also teaches us the importance of longevity. Objects like committee pamphlets or conference notes reveal how organizers built infrastructures, small, consistent acts that sustain communities long after the protests have ended. These quieter documents emphasize that change is not just immediate action, but also persistence, memory, and networks of care that we must continue. Personal keepsakes like annotated letters or a child's lock of hair, which we saw, remind us that movements are also multi-generational. They show us that hope needs to be carried forward, the way one person's act of saving a scrap of paper becomes a message to our future researchers or activists or artists. So one of the lessons I'm choosing to take with me is to not underestimate the power of the small, the intimate, and the personal.
That's so beautiful. I think my remarks or response to this is maybe a little bit more informal, but I was just thinking about how, given our political moment when everything feels very dire, our neighbors are being valued, community members are being kidnapped, our government is enabling and facilitating a genocide, our higher education is under attack. I feel like everything is so polarized, and it's difficult to know how to talk to people who have different political beliefs than we have. And I think Cologne has really given me some ideas about how to talk to people that see themselves as apolitical or maybe have different political opinions than mine. I think it's a skill that we're losing nowadays. And how can we talk to people that have different beliefs and values from us, and how can we win them over to our side? So one story that Jesus Colon wrote, it's in his book, A Puerto Rican in New York. It's called Carmencita, and it's this story about this when his conservative Catholic mother-in-law comes to visit him in New York City and then sees all his Marxist books on the shelves and thinks that he's like a godless heathen. And it's a story about how they slowly get to know one another, and it's a story about how he wins her over to becoming a Marxist, and how he does this by engaging in conversation with her and inviting her to be curious and inviting her to observe and see things with her own eyes, to see racism in New York City with her own eyes, to get to know people that are like anti-fascist organizers. And by conversations and by seeing things with your own eyes and by learning through experience, then that would be a way to kind of bridge some of those gaps. So that's one thing that I've been really thinking about. And I think, Estelle, I loved your comment about like how movements are built on everyday moments of intimate practice, and also like Coco, what you said about the heartbeats of liberation. Those are so beautiful, like just beautiful phrases and ideas. And I think they remind me of the importance of joy in movement organizing. I think like I've talked to you about how I found pictures of all these activities that these social movement or community organizations would do, like Mother's Day parties or like beauty pageants with these children that are beauty queens, and they're so adorable. All the tickets to community outings to the park and parties. And I know someone here that organizes trips for undocumented folks to go on trips together. And she's told me that it's really hard to get grants for that kind of thing because nobody wants to fund joy. So I think that, I don't know, just seeing how joy was a part of, and the social element was just a part of organizing, I think is something that really is a lesson.
Thank you both.
Thank you. Wow, there's just so much amazing insight. And I that what you just said, Alexandria, just really resonates about the importance of joy and finding joy in this movement, right? And about that, creating space for conversation, which I think is something that's present in all of your work and in your exploration of the archives. We have time for maybe one question from the audience. So if anybody in the chat or in the Q&A would like to jump in. I know I'm really excited to go explore some of the collections that you talked about during my time at Centro. The Richie Perez papers, the Jesus Colon. I didn't know there were like holiday cards and magnets and all of these wonderful things, and now I want to go and look at them. So I'm really excited about all this work that you've done. Any questions? I have a lot for you guys as well, but if anybody in the audience wants to jump in.
Questions or also comments too are
Yeah.
welcomed. Curious what's on y'all's minds.
I think, in case anybody doesn't want to jump in, I do, and we sort of touched upon a little bit, and I think especially Alexandria really hit on this during her last comment, but maybe Coco and Estelle can jump into what's kinds of hidden or under-celebrated moments of individual or familiar or communal flourishing did you find in the archives, right? I think, Alex was talking about these like pageants or parties and the funding of, trying these spaces for joy, right? I don't know if there was any particular story that jumped out when you were doing work in the archive that you'd like to share with folks in these last 5 minutes.
I mean, similarly, I really enjoyed seeing the Latinas in Power photographs of the gatherings at the home. While I was intentionally trying to see the objects in the home, I couldn't help but sort of notice the empowerment, the female empowerment specifically of so many Latinas in power. And sort of the gathering that happened, I think specifically in the home and not in the office, feels really important. To let someone into your home, I think is such a big deal, right? So like just thinking about how these sort of meetings and these conversations were happening probably surrounded by food, but food that was like homemade and on someone's couch and in someone's living room. Yeah.
So real quick, something that I wasn't able to go into, but was also looking at was the incredible queer and trans movements involved in the Puerto Rican diaspora. And this is a quote from the first gay pride or Marcha de Orgullo Gay in San Juan in 1991, and thinking about also ways that they were borrowing from and being inspired by the South African anti-apartheid struggle. And this is a quotation that I'll put in the chat. Contrary to the stereotype that all Latinos are homophobic, Puerto Ricans are one community where gays, lesbians, and transgendered people have won a space. In the PR Gay Pride contingent, a Dominican drag queen, a Colombian faggot, a Brazilian dyke are all marching alongside in a parade intended to celebrate Puerto Ricanidad. So thinking about the kind of coalitional power that's in our communities and that other people see and also want to collaborate in. So one piece to hopefully inspire folks.
Thank you so much. I think that is a wonderful place to stop this conversation, a conversation that I hope continues, after this summer. And for everybody in the audience, I want to encourage you also to keep in touch with what Centro's doing. These wonderful fellows applied last year for this opportunity. We will have future opportunities for researchers, for artists, to receive funding to spend time in our archives. So follow us on social media and keep an eye out for those. And again, I really want to thank Alexandria, Coco, and Estelle for sharing their wonderful work with us. And we hope to see you all soon at another event. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you. Have a good
everyone.
night.
Good night.
Thank you.